Yours. Please proceed.
Thank you, Zaman. Hi, everyone. I'm April Taylor. I'm a Chickasaw member and Chickasaw staff at the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And basically, I'm a tribal liaison for Oklahoma and Mexico, Texas, and in Louisiana. And I've been in the position almost 10 years. We have a tribal engagement program here in Norman, Oklahoma, and we have three areas that we work in. We have a workforce development, and we mentor Native students. We have offered over 60 trainings for tribal staff on climate change related issues. And then we have our research arm where we partner and fund research. And so today, as Saman was saying, we put together this roundtable discussion to talk about tribal transportation challenges and needs related to climate change. And so we have two panelists that I'll introduce. Our first one is going to be Chaz Jones. Chaz is a tribal liaison like myself with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians and with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And he'll be talking about tribal infrastructure and climate, tribal priorities and unmet funding needs. And then after that, we'll have Sharon Hosman. She is also with the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center here with me, but she's on the University of Oklahoma side. And she's going to talk about the tribal transportation climate vulnerability assessments and what that consists of. And then, as Damon mentioned, I'll be moderating the chat box, and at the end we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion. And so please think about that and enter in the chat box your questions. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Chaz.
Well, thank you, April. Appreciate the introduction. And I do have slides that I will go ahead and share with everyone. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the topic of conversation. Something that's really important and very timely given all of the infrastructure talk that has been a priority for the federal administration most recently. So my name's Chaz Jones, and as April mentioned, I am ATNI's, I work for the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians as their tribal resilience liaison. And I also work for the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center.
But it does have first floor.
Oh, thank you. I sit just outside. I live in Philomath, Oregon, which is just outside of Corvallis, Oregon, the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples. And I work in my role as tribal liaison. I work with infrastructure issues and climate change quite a bit. But just as an interesting tidbit, I'm also the mayor of Philomath, Oregon, where we also deal with a lot of tribal infrastructure, or not tribal infrastructure, but a lot of infrastructure topics just generally. But I'm just going to cut to the chase. This is based on a presentation and a report that we developed for tribes across the nation, where we looked at the impacts of tribal infrastructure, the impacts of climate on tribal infrastructure. But some of the take-home messages that I took from my efforts to, one, work on that report and in my efforts to work with tribes, is that tribal infrastructure is already experiencing the impacts of climate. And I'm sure many of you already know that and are aware of it. But when looking at planning projects for tribes, it would really benefit the tribes to develop cost estimates, rough or more detailed, for their different infrastructure related projects. Because once you have some ballpark number for a project, that you can then put that in front of a policymaker and money and funding is one thing that policymakers have control of. So if you can give them at least some sort of a ballpark number of what a project might cost, policymakers can be more effective if they understand your needs. But I took out most of the specifics about climate change and impacts on tribes because I thought we were going to have another speaker, but I can talk to that briefly here. Climate impacts are very broad reaching, and many of these images that you see are actually based in the Northwest, but are relevant across the nation, except for maybe some of the snow stuff. But climate impacts everything. And the impacts are far reaching across sectors, from natural resources to infrastructure to our social systems as well. It impacts our human health, our community health, and our infrastructure. And so the one thing about climate impacts are that they're really just a threat multiplier. So everything that makes my community vulnerable to anything, whether it be having low economic development or low economic opportunities, or maybe I live in a rural community, or maybe my community might struggle with poor education systems, or maybe we don't have any trees because they've all been cut down. But every one of the things that make my community more vulnerable, climate simply acts as a threat multiplier to those systems. And so if we are able to address any of those priorities, any of those concerns, that's going to help us become more resilient to climate change. And infrastructure is no different. And one thing that was very clear, I'm going to talk a little bit about the report that we developed, but one thing that was very clear when looking at this report is that our existing infrastructure is not and was not designed or constructed for the modern climate as we're experiencing it now. And many aspects of tribal infrastructure is highly vulnerable to climate change. And it's really important that, our tribes, our communities, everyone plan on having reliable infrastructure systems. It's just, the foundation of our existence is that we plan on our infrastructure systems being reliable. And so if our existing infrastructure is not designed or constructed for the existing climate, that means that we do not have a reliable infrastructure system as it is right now. The report that I'm going to be discussing, we really looked specifically at infrastructure impacts caused by flooding and erosion and drought-induced wildfire primarily. And those impacts included sea level rise, storm surges, river flooding, and other extreme events. We didn't look at tornadoes except those that were included in the tribal hazard mitigation plans or the county hazard mitigation plans that we reviewed. And our assessment was actually done on a national level. So we did, and I will pull out the little bit of information that I have for the South Central region, but most of our efforts was really focused on taking the regional information for the 9 different regions across the US that we identified, and then making it more relevant for the nation's leaders and policy leaders. So this information was really provided to Congress. But in the next 50 years, we identified that there was almost $3.5 billion needed for Alaskan infrastructure. And that includes a lot of infrastructure relocation due to sea level rise and storm surges. But there is $1.4 billion that was going to be needed in the lower 48 states. And those needs are now, not over the next 50 years. So we didn't do the analysis in the exact same way, so it's not directly comparable, but But yeah, we identified $1.4 billion in need right now. We also noted that there was a large need for technical support to assist tribes in identifying the projects, figuring out what infrastructure was at risk, and to figure out how to overcome the institutional barriers and how to fund those projects. But there's also there's a lack of information and data available to actually identify the infrastructure needs. And we dealt with a lot of relocation efforts or aspects in the Northwest and in Alaska, and relocation is complex, and that may be it's relevant in the Louisiana area for sure. And I'm not really sure about its relevance in other aspects of the South Central area. But in doing our assessment, we basically looked at hazard mitigation plans for tribes specifically is what we were looking for, but sometimes we had to look at county, city, and other jurisdictional hazard mitigation plans. We also looked at adaptation plans for tribes and vulnerability assessments. And then we called folks like April and others and incorporated their expert knowledge and their knowledge of the specific regions into our assessments as well. We looked at relocation plans when they existed, and there's not many of those. And then we looked at climatic, economic assessments that looked at climate impacts. So we incorporated all that into this report that we put together and provided to the BIA. So that it now exists on the BIA's website. And if you Google or do a web search on Tribal Resilience Program Relocation Report, you will find it. So that was on the BIA's website, Tribal Resilience Program Relocation Report. And I apologize, my slides appear to be on an automatic timer. And I guess I didn't test it in the presentation mode. But these are the regions that we looked at for our analysis. And you will see that the Southern Plains region incorporates Kansas, Oklahoma, the Eastern Oklahoma region separately, and the Southern Plains region. And so I pulled out the data for the Southern Plains region. I didn't pull in information for Arkansas or Louisiana because I don't have that available to me as easily as just the individual regions. So that's what I'll be discussing here. And it looks like Paul Sittig found the report, and I'm gonna not click on that link right now, but we can look at that later, or someone else can see if that's the location for the report. So when looking at the report, again, we were looking at a national scale. So we only had 5 weeks to do the entire analysis. So we were on a big time crunch, and we were trying to get this information to Congress very quickly because they were trying to incorporate this information into bills that they were wanting to look at. This report was also finished in spring of 2020. So right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. But we basically separated out any specific projects that had been identified and planned for any tribe across the nation. And so if you identified a specific plan or project that identified an infrastructure need related to climate impacts, then we would have identified that. And if there was a dollar amount available, we would have put that into our database. If you provided no dollar amounts, we just identified it as a project and said that there was an unknown funding need for that. But if as a tribe or as an other jurisdiction, if you did not look at wildfire threats to your infrastructure across numerous sectors that we looked at, and I'll show you those in a bit. But if you didn't even look at wildfire, or it was not included in your hazard mitigation plan, and we said, well, that was an unmet need. So there was a planning need to look at wildfire there. If you did not look at sea level rise and you were on the coast, and you didn't look at the impacts of sea level rise on your education system, then we would say, well, that was a planning need. And we essentially summed up the total need. I think we made an assumption that to do an assessment on each sector for each type of impact, it'd be 100, or maybe it's just for each sector for all the impacts. I think it was gonna be $150,000 to do a planning study on the education system for instance, and I'm making this up, the Chickasaw Nation. If you wanted to look at the transportation system for the Nez Perce tribe, then that would be another $150,000. But, or you could look at the education for the Nez Perce tribe, and that'd be $150,000. But there was a certain number of sectors, and I can't remember that off the top of my head. But to look at each one of those, we assumed that it'd be $150,000 just to look at it, so you can make up a plan and identify your infrastructure needs. So that was just some of the basic assumptions that we had to do in order to come up with some sort of ballpark figures here. But you can see that we identified in the lower 48, we identified $1.4 billion in identified infrastructure response actions and $425 million in planning needs. Was there a question?
Yeah, for those asking questions, please unmute and then you can ask.
And then we have some numbers for Alaska that I won't go into too much detail, but I already summarized it a little bit. Again, we had specific site assessments that were needed and then implementation projects. But specifically for the Southern Plains and Oklahoma region, Eastern Oklahoma region, and I apologize, this top line, the top row is not number of implementation projects. That should read number of planning projects. Number of implementation projects is actually the third row there. So I apologize for that mislabeling. But you can see that we identified a total of 396 different types or locations for and different types of infrastructure that would needed to be still studied. And the estimated cost was almost $60 million to perform those planning studies. So there's a large planning need, essentially, is what we identified. And the number of implementation projects that we found in your region was quite low, only 9 total. And of those 9 projects, you can see that the total was estimated, we had $28.1 million identified for the estimated cost. But there were plenty of these planning projects that were identified simply did not have dollars amounts accompanying the identified threat. So you can see if the planning need included 396 potential studies that need to be done at a cost of $60 million just for the planning studies, but the implementation projects are near $30 million, but it's only 9 projects, that there's a huge potential for a much larger need for implementation funding. We just didn't have the data available to even start to assess any additional funding needs. So again, many tribes across the nation would identify a threat and would identify a threat to a particular type of infrastructure, but that they'd stop there. They wouldn't say, well, they wouldn't put it on a scale of $5 amounts versus $1 amount. Maybe building a bridge would be $1 sign versus building a new reservoir would be $5 signs to tackle it. But there was no sense of scale for how much these projects would cost, and so we couldn't even look at that. So it was a huge data gap. But we faced a lot of challenges, and our assessment could certainly be improved upon. again, we had 5 weeks to perform this analysis for the entire nation and all the tribes, 574 tribes. COVID was happening and was right at the beginning, and we had a hard time getting people to reply to our emails. Our project just was not their priority, understandably. But that was we had a 5-week period that was offered to us, and we had to act on that, and we had to.
We are today with Brick Venables. It worked out exactly the way that he.
Sorry about that. And a lot of tribes, a lot of the hazard mitigation plans, especially outside, like I remember in the South Central region and in the East, many tribes were incorporated into the county and state hazard mitigation plans. And they may have identified a location that was a threat, but those locations were not identified as a on tribal lands specifically. So not being from the area, we didn't have the inside information to be able to say, oh, that's a tribal project. It's simply identified it by the town name or by the road name and didn't say it was on tribal land. So we weren't able to incorporate some of those. So there was some of that lack of information and lack of familiarity. It was on us, but didn't allow us to actually incorporate those impacts into our report. And then, yeah, most of that I already covered. So that's all I really have. There's a huge funding need, but we have a lot of work to do just in order to do the assessments to identify what infrastructure is at threat. We have communities like this trailer and manufactured home facility at the Umatilla tribe. These people's homes are being impacted on every year or every 2 years. And a lot of tribes are experiencing those types of impacts and they just deal with it. But I think we need more specific planning to try to figure out how we can build the infrastructure so that these common occurrences do not continue happening into the future. That's the summation of my report, and I'd be happy to take any questions or let Sharon kick it off and we can have our discussion after that. Thank you.
And Chaz, will you just follow up to make sure that the report is shared in the chat?
Absolutely.
We did have one question specific to what you were talking about. And the question was, are there unique aspects of tribal transportation challenges in light of climate change?
You said NEPA aspects?
Yes.
That is not my area of expertise anymore at all, but there's certainly every project would need a NEPA review, I would expect, if it's going to deal with any aspect of infrastructure. Sharon, do you work with NEPA? And if I remember correctly, yeah, every project I worked as a consultant had to have a NEPA review.
Generally, yes, there would be, a need for NEPA reviews. My video just disappeared. And I don't know why, my apologies. But yes, generally NEPA would be required at some level, but whether or not it would just be a categorical exclusion or an environmental assessment or on up to a full environmental impact statement, would vary. And most transportation projects typically wouldn't require an environmental impact statement. And of course, that also, varies based on work that's already been done and the analysis that's been done, if it's an existing road and things like that.
Right. Thanks, Sharon. Appreciate that jumping in.
And I would say,
sorry. I was going to speak to the NEPA. If you're using the federal monies, obviously it's the NEPA, that's the federal nexus. And then, as she said, most of them, if it's under $5 million, will fit into a categorical exclusion category. Adopting the federal highway CEs.
Great, thank you, Pamela.
I was
Appreciate that.
just going to respond, it's hard to say what the unique challenges with climate change are because every tribe is different and in a different location and addressing different challenges for climate change, across the nation. With many communities being frontline communities on, they're addressing sea level rise and permafrost in some areas versus your inland tribes and that are dealing with extreme floods or and so it just depends on the tribe and the differences there, I would say, more than anything.
So Jazz, I have one question that in terms of, let's say, the time difference between planning and implementation, of course, it will vary from project to project and also from one tribe to another tribe. What's your general sense? Of course, the funding needed, to implement is also another challenge. So, what's your experience in this area?
Well, I'm sure many people here know how long it takes to get infrastructure projects moving. Oftentimes they're identified a decade in advance before they really are able to start get implemented. So, and planning needs to occur before that. It can just vary a lot. And sometimes you identify a need and you might not get to it for 30 years. I know in my role as mayor, I was surprised that when I went and looked at the comprehensive planning document for our community from 25 years ago, it had the same 5 priorities that I have now. And so I think that, the amount of timing that's necessary between planning and implementation depends on, one, your priorities and how high it's prioritized or how impactful this threat is to your community. And then how is the available funding? Can you identify it? Can you get it can you get a policymaker on board? And that also is dependent upon your relationship with your policymakers or that of your leadership with policymakers and someone that's actually willing to advocate for you. So there's no easy answer there.
And then we had a question, and this I'll just open this up to, I think this has to do with tribal transportation and climate funding. And so they're asking, what are the funding sources for tribal transportation and climate?
Yeah, I think that varies a bit by region, but the aspects that I'm most familiar with, and you said transportation clearly, would be that state funding and federal highway, the Department of Transportation Systems, I think would be the big ones. Also in FEMA has funding available for protecting infrastructure, but also for developing the hazard mitigation plans. April, do you have a more comprehensive answer than that?
And then obviously BIA Tribal Climate Resilience Program has been funding for many years for the planning, and many of the tribes are including transportation in their climate adaptation plans. And so at this time, the BIA is not funding implementation, but definitely on the planning side of things.
And of course, these can be incorporated into mainstream plans. And so while the BIA is not specifically funding climate projects, the intent of assessing the need and moving forward with the vulnerability assessments related to climate impacts on transportation facilities is to support the design and construction of more climate ready infrastructure in the future. To ensure BIA funds transportation projects, as does the Federal Highway Administration, and do state DOTs through often using federal money And the goal is, as those projects are funded for rehabilitation or reconstruction, to incorporate climate needs into those. And again, I apologize for not having my video. I've been trying to get it to work. I've gone into settings, and I fear that perhaps it has just failed on the laptop because I cannot get it to work.
And then I was just going to mention, so then depending on what the climate impact or what you're talking about, if you're not taking a comprehensive approach, let's say you wanted to do a drought plan, there are other types of funding for drought planning. For example, the Bureau of Reclamation has been funding tribes for drought plans, for example. So Chickasaw Nation, our drought plan was funded through the Bureau of Reclamation.
And then Clark brings up the fact that some states or regulatory funding agencies may not consider certain types of climatic data as appropriate or valid. In the Northwest, I haven't really seen that specifically, but I know a lot of tribes use these planning projects, or they identify these projects in their different planning documents, and then use that for justification for why the project is needed. But yeah, it's a good point. And I'm not super familiar with the South Central region.
All right. Well, I don't see any further questions at this time in the chat box, so I'm going to turn it over to Sharon to give her presentation. And
Thank you, April. Let me share my screen. And if you could confirm, April, with a nod that it is up. Thank you, April and Dr. Zaman, appreciate that. So I am going to talk about climate vulnerability assessments specifically, and referencing back just to them as a tool that can help determine what some of those needs are for specific roads. And then ultimately, the vulnerability assessment is one step in a climate adaptation plan, or the information can be used in other plans, moving towards those engineering designs and cost estimates. I'm going to talk about my work with the Pueblo of Laguna. I have been with the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center for 2 months. And prior to that, I was the planning program manager at the Pueblo of Laguna for almost 13 years. And so a lot of my experience with climate adaptation planning and also with transportation planning is from the Pueblo of Laguna. Prior to that, I worked for the Pueblo of Sandia and also did some transportation work with Sandia. I am located in Albuquerque on traditional Southern Tiwa Pueblo lands. So I'm working remotely for the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. I also teach part-time at the University of New Mexico in the Community and Regional Planning program. And so I see some of my New Mexico colleagues and Pueblo of Laguna colleagues are here today, and I'm happy to connect with you, and also just want to thank Dr. Zaman and April for coordinating this roundtable today. Looking forward to the conversation. So I know many people, although the Pueblo of Laguna is within the South Central region, many of you, of course, are not in New Mexico, and you may not be familiar with it, but there are 19 pueblos in New Mexico. The Pueblo of Laguna is one of them and is located to the west of Albuquerque. The Pueblo's lands lie within 4 counties, and there are 6 distinct villages at the Pueblo of Laguna. And this is very different from some of the tribes in Oklahoma and other parts of the Southern Plains region. Laguna has about 500,000 acres that are held in trust, and almost all of the lands were not allotted. The Pueblos were very lucky compared to many other tribes in that their lands weren't allotted. The checkerboard area is actually checkerboarded with BLM land, and the BLM land was the land that is not BLM was regained by the Pueblo. So it's not indicative of allotment. So we started the process at the Pueblo of Laguna really by introducing the concept of climate adaptation planning, focusing on what the Pueblo Council had already stated as their priorities. And as Chaz was saying, infrastructure, of course, is a strong unmet need in many tribal communities, whether there are climate change issues or not. And for the Pueblo of Laguna, the council annually adopts its top priorities. And those priorities have included infrastructure, and they've also included healthcare. And climate effects were not really part of the primary discussion at the Pueblo, but what we wanted to do was focus on the areas that were the primary topics of conversation among council and begin the conversation about climate adaptation planning that way. So we chose infrastructure and healthcare, and obviously I'll focus on infrastructure today. The Pueblo does have a robust infrastructure and capital planning process. Every year, the planning program puts together a capital improvement plan. And that capital improvement plan lists all of the Pueblo's proposed capital projects, transportation and other buildings, infrastructure, and large equipment. One of the great challenges, as Chaz was suggesting, is getting cost estimates for all of those projects. But of course, as the project evolves from the planning stage into the engineering design stage, and then becomes ready for construction, the cost estimates advance and become more refined. We used the classic vulnerability assessment model, and we were funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resilience Program for this project. The model looks at exposure, at what the actual climate effects will be, the types of climate change. It looks at sensitivity, the elements that will be affected by climate change, and combines those to assess the potential impact. That is also considered in light of the community's adaptive capacity, which means the community's ability to respond to those impacts. Some communities are in a better position to address the impacts than others for a variety of reasons. Those are combined to determine the vulnerability. And then once there's an assessment of the vulnerability and the prioritization, it becomes possible to do more effective adaptation planning, to start developing different goals and strategies and actions. In this case, those may be modifications to the transportation facilities. We did have the BIA Tribal Resilience Program funding, and so we contracted out the work. We put out a request for proposals and contracted with the lead firm of Adaptation International. We had a local engineering firm. They operate not just locally, but they are located in Albuquerque, Bohannon, Houston. And we also worked with CLIMAS, the Climate Assessment for the Southwest, which is a NOAA regional integrated, I've forgotten what RESA stands for, but a NOAA funded program. And another consulting firm was EcoPlan International. We had the support of numerous Pueblo programs and departments for this assessment. So we began through CLIMAS looking at the downscaled exposure on Laguna lands. So specifically assessing what the climate changes would be in terms of temperature and precipitation and other changes on the Pueblo's lands. And looking at the Pueblo's lands was really important to the community. There's a lot of data that's available at the county level, but Laguna, as I mentioned, has land in 4 counties. And the county level really doesn't respect the Pueblo's sovereignty. The counties do not have any governance authority on the Pueblo's lands whatsoever. And so it's really important to look at the exposure data within the boundaries of the Pueblo. The elements that were modeled for this were temperature and precipitation. And there were other elements that the Pueblo really would have liked to have gotten more information on, but they're harder to model. It's very hard to project precise types of drought in the future. We can say with some confidence that there will be more drought, but exactly what that will look like is difficult to determine. And the same is true of flooding and erosion and also fire. When it gets to impacts like wind and hail, it's nearly impossible to model those. The climate models are just not there yet. We expect there will be higher winds and we expect there's likely to be more hail, but really we don't know quite what that is going to look like exactly. So at the Pueblo of Laguna, in terms of temperature, by the 2050s, we expect to see average temperatures going up by about 5 degrees, and by the 2100s by about 10 degrees. Precipitation, the average amount of precipitation will probably stay about the same. What we were interested in more specifically was the number of days with more than 1 inch of precipitation. So that's sort of a proxy for extreme rainfall at the Pueblo. So by the 2050s, there's expected to be an increase of about 4 to 5 days with more than 1 inch. And by the 2100s, an increase of about 7 days per year. And there'll also be an increase of days with no precipitation at all. We also had the team look at heat waves, specifically more than 2 days in a row where temperatures went above 95 degrees. And the Pueblo has historically experienced about 2 of these a year, but they'll probably become far more common with 5 to 6 heat waves per year by 2050 and up to 8 per year by 2100. The team also looked at heat waves above 105 degrees, which the Pueblo really has not had at this point, but they may start after 2050. Again, in terms of precipitation, the total annual will be about the same. There's a lot of natural variability in precipitation. We have summer monsoons in New Mexico, but again, there may be those changes in the daily precipitation with more days per year with above 1 inch of rainfall per day. The team then also looked in great detail at all of the possible exposures on roads and bridges that could occur anywhere on the Pueblo's land. So this was a high-level overview and discussion of what that might look like. In other words, how does the climate exposure affect the sensitivity of the transportation facilities? The effects of extreme heat, it could cause pavement on both roads and bike and pedestrian facilities, could soften and expand. However, roads are resurfaced periodically and the pavement mix can be adjusted for higher temperatures. Extreme heat could also affect bridge decking depending on the decking materials. Bridge expansion joints and bearings could potentially be affected, but they're designed for fairly large temperature ranges up to 120 degrees. So Laguna's bridges aren't really expected to be affected. The Pueblo also has a bike and pedestrian network, which is fairly new and a pretty important part of its transportation infrastructure in terms of community support for this effort. And during COVID, really, it's been a well-used active transportation and recreation facility since people have not been able to go to the fitness center and be inside. Extreme heat has a different kind of effect on those. There's the pavement impact, but more important, the extreme heat has an effect on the users who are not going to be out biking and walking during heat waves outside the protection of a vehicle with air conditioning. Extreme precipitation is likely to have a bigger effect on transportation facilities at the Pueblo of Laguna. And for roads, this really depends on their location in relation to waterways and how they're constructed, especially the size of culverts. Culverts should have initially been sized based on historic rainfall, and if the precipitation events are larger, they may now be undersized. Bridges obviously are subject to flowing water, and they may be vulnerable if there are more extreme precipitation events and if waterways expand or change course. They may be subject to erosion and scouring, and also to wind erosion if soils are dry due to drought, and that could compromise the piers and the substructure or the foundation. So the team found really that the key sensitivity for all of the transportation facilities was flooding and drainage, and that extreme precipitation and runoff could overtop bridges and could make roads impassable. And there's a whole level of cascading effects from that. The other component of the vulnerability assessments that were funded were health and wellness. And of course, not having road access means that people can't get to medical facilities, can't get to medical appointments, can't get prescriptions, can't get healthy foods. Also, undersized culverts and sedimentation can limit drainage capacity. So even if there isn't that much precipitation, if you have a plugged culvert, then you can still have that flooding. The Pueblo couldn't analyze every single roadway, so the planning program and the Pueblo team with Public Works selected a certain number of roads for more detailed analysis. And this relates back to the fact that there are the 6 villages at Laguna, and some of those villages have more transportation access than others, also more population. So it was important to really think about which roads to study for this project. And also then to look more closely at some of the bridges along those roadways. The Pueblo selected 3 interstate or state facilities, Interstate 40 and 2 state highways, and then the rest of the roads were Bureau of Indian Affairs facilities, and in some cases, the trails that paralleled them. The team looked at the plan sets for these roads where they were available, but as many of you may know, sometimes the older roads, the original plan sets, are not readily accessible. And if they are accessible, there may not be that much information on them. Current plan sets would naturally have information about the design storm and how the culvert sizes were determined, but many of the plan sets that the team reviewed did not have that information readily available. So without that, it's difficult, short of new hydrologic studies, to assess whether those culverts, what the historical design was for, and whether or not we're going to see greater storms now, and thus the culverts are undersized. The team looked at all the bridges on selected BIA roads. They also looked at major watersheds and major culverts. They did site visits to over 40 locations and looked more closely at 23 specific areas that they recommended for more analysis. The team also looked at adaptive capacity, the ability of communities, institutions, or people to adjust to potential hazards, to take advantage of opportunities, or to respond to consequences. And vulnerability assessments for transportation facilities, there's no manual that anyone on the team could find about how to go about this. And so this really was evolving as the team was working on it. What does it mean to have adaptive capacity for climate impacts on transportation? And in this case, the available information was something that was viewed as an adaptive benefit. So if a plan set was available and did talk about how the roadways were designed, that would add to the adaptive capacity. Another element of adaptive capacity that was important was the maintenance capacity. Those plugged culverts are plugged because they're not being maintained as frequently as they should be for the most part. And that is affected by who has jurisdiction over the roadway and their ability with their staffing to maintain it properly. So using all of that information, the team created vulnerability profiles, individual profiles for each of the specific roadways that were assessed. They looked at the sensitivity, and they also factored in the connectivity in terms of how significant that road was as perhaps a single access point to one of the villages. They also looked at the population in each of the villages. So the village of Encinal has only one road to and from the village, one paved road to and from the village. But the village of Encinal also only has about 200 people. So its connectivity importance was slightly less than the connectivity value for the village of Powati, which also only has one paved road, but has a higher population. And they factored in the adaptive capacity and then used all of those following a model really spelled out by a number of different adaptation planning guidebooks and used by the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals to do an overall assessment of vulnerability. So this is one example from one of the state roads, New Mexico 124, which also has a paved bike and pedestrian trail adjacent to it. The connectivity value of it is very high. It's a major access route that provides access to multiple villages. It has been repaved recently, and the roadway is in good condition. There are shoulders along the roadway, which make it less vulnerable to erosion. According to information from the National Bridge Inventory, the bridges are considered to be in fair condition or better for the deck, superstructure, and substructure, but bridge inspection reports weren't available for review. There are two locations that are of drainage concern. They're along unnamed waterways, and they have had significant debris buildup recently, and also sediment deposition along the trail. So the team combined all of this information, did profiles for each roadway, and then prepared a table looking at the overall vulnerability. And this information then can be used by the Pueblo to continue to prioritize work for the project. As I was saying in the questions and answers after Chaz's presentation, often the way funding works for roadways is these roads will be scheduled fairly regularly, although not often enough, for rehabilitation or reconstruction. And so the prioritization of the work on them may or may not be due specifically to their vulnerability. You can see here that Encinal Road has a high vulnerability, which could trigger a little more effort to get Encinal Road redesigned and reconstructed, but it might also be that other roads that are medium high or medium will rise to the top quicker simply because they have, it's been longer since they were previously redesigned and reconstructed. So they may already be in the pipeline. And the goal will be just to make sure that their redesign meets climate standards. The Pueblo of Laguna Council did adopt a resolution in November of 2020, accepting the reports from the consultant effort, including the report on the vulnerability of infrastructure and buildings. They directed the planning program to continue coordination of climate adaptation planning, and also requested that state, local, and federal agencies and regional planning organizations address climate change impacts and adaptation actions. So some of that is relevant, again, going back to that adaptive capacity issue of maintenance and encouraging the state, the federal government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs to do more for maintenance, do more in their design and in their planning, because so many of these roads are not managed directly by the Pueblo. The adoption by council also recommended next steps of forming a community group. This was really a technical report designed to assess the vulnerability, but the next phase of the project is really intended to engage the community look at some best practices and design those strategies and prioritize them. So thank you. And I am also happy to answer questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. That was great. So we do have a question specific to lagunas. So the question is, how important is transportation for lagunas compared to other infrastructure such as water or power? And could there be citations provided?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Zaman. It's an interesting question. Water is, of course, almost always the top priority infrastructure item for any tribe. And it has been for Laguna over the years, but Laguna was very lucky, not lucky, was skilled also and able to obtain what was at the time the largest USDA grant loan package to a tribe to completely overhaul its water system. They had a tremendous number of water line breaks. There were a lot of risks of contamination, and the Pueblo got funding to completely overhaul it. So as a result of that, the water infrastructure right now is in good condition. And for that reason, other aspects of infrastructure are not necessarily as critical. The Pueblo also does not have some of the challenges that some other tribes have with getting power to homes. Pretty much all the homes are grid connected, so it's not a matter of making sure that homes have power. So transportation is an important priority for the community.
So I think, Sharon, excellent presentation and a lot of information. So in terms of your, you talked about, flooding and drainage, that is really important in the sense that sometimes actually we are seeing, 500-year flood instead of 100. So that is very, very problematic. So do you have any assessment if that type of event happens, then what percentages of culverts, for example, would be very inadequate? And you also talked about maintenance. That is very, very true, that you have drainage infrastructure, but they are not maintained. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Zaman. One of the things that the consultant team reminded the Pueblo of throughout the project was that they were not funded to do complete hydrologic studies for all of the roads. And I think we started off not even really having as clear a picture that the issues were going to be so dominated by drainage. So what they did in their report was begin to recommend the roadways and the specific points along those roadways where drainage was most likely to be an issue. And I think there isn't an adaptation plan per se yet, but I think one of the key things that would be part of that would really be doing those hydrologic studies going forward and modeling in more detail what the drainage will look like and how it relates to the current road design. But that level of detail isn't quite there yet. And I'm sorry, you had a second part, the maintenance side of it.
The maintenance, yeah.
The maintenance side of it is an ongoing conversation with the multiple jurisdictions that are responsible for road maintenance, particularly the New Mexico Department of Transportation.
I would say that's probably something unique to working with tribal transportation is the jurisdictional issues of whether is it on tribal jurisdiction or not, and those sort of dynamics. And then also with BIA, right? So BIA is another entity that would have to be considered, and whose jurisdiction is it?
Right, and there are multiple ways that tribes interact with the BIA. Also, for that jurisdiction, tribes can 638 contract both maintenance and the design and construction of roadways. And that's one way of approaching it, but also tribes can do government to government with Federal Highway Administration, and that affects those conversations as well. And there's, of course, very limited funding. I think, anyone who works with BIA transportation or any federal program to tribes really is well aware that most of the programs are seriously underfunded.
Right. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box. Would anybody like to unmute themselves and ask either of our presenters a question?
So I see actually Larry Patrick in the group, April. So, I think you talk about drainage, and of course drainage, relative to culvert or bridge could be a problem. But in terms of pavement also, we know that the pavement performance is very much related to drainage. So maybe this is not only a challenge for the tribes, but also in general. So I do not know, Larry, would you like to make some comment in this regard as to what Oklahoma Asphalt Pavement Association or your other colleagues thinking about pavement drainage relative to the current bill? There is a section on porous pavement also. So maybe Larry, I think you are the experienced person in the group, and I don't see everyone, so I'm sure that there are other people as well.
Hello, everybody. Just some thoughts. I know with the climate changes that are going on right now, asphalt is looking for other things to look at, something more durable, and we're kind of assessing or working on that from a standpoint of a balanced mix design. Actually, you're trying to create a performance-based mix design that you're going to have some testing that you can do for cracking. You can do testing for rutting, that it's going to come more into play. Actually, ODOT, with what we did back in 2012, where we actually decreased on super pave, decreased the gyrations and everything, we've actually created a more durable mixes. And some of the baseline testing that has been done by ODOT is actually indicating that what we did back in 2012 has actually made our asphalts more durable and more crack resistant and more rut resistant. So we're seeing some awful good information that's coming from that. And this comes into play as we see, like you talked about, the heating, the rutting, getting softer, and we have so much more products that we can use to help us with this. I'm excited about where we're going. I'm very excited about it because I think we're going to see that durability increase. Is that what you're kind of looking for, Dr. Zaman?
That's partly, and also I think what will happen, Larry, that the pavement will always have crack and water will get in. Just a matter of time. And of course, you are very right that the BMD shows a lot of promise in terms of actually increasing durability of pavement. And I think that's really wonderful work that you all are doing. But in terms of, let's say, if the water does get in, how does it get out? And also the other point that I sort of see happening more frequently, Larry, is that what happens if pavement gets flooded? So how do we actually take, and how long? And sometimes it may get flooded for days. We don't know, simply because of the type of event that we're seeing with climate change. Then what does it do, even in the BMD context, Larry? What does it do to the overall durability?
And I think there's some things that can be done. I'm a definite believer in using ag bases and then letting them be daylighted to the outside so that they drain. This helps gets the water out quicker. If you're in a flooding situation, that way the water does drain out a whole lot quicker than what it would if you had those outside edges that were kind of where you got shouldering up material that you bring up to the edge. With the daylighting, it does let that water out.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is very true. So what I was making a point that this drainage issue is not only specific to bridge, but also mute, please, Michael. I think so this is also pavement is very much part of that discussion. So thanks for sharing your thoughts. I see.
To ask
Yeah,
our
please.
panelists, so if you were pursuing a grant or in this area of tribal transportation and climate change, what would your sort of immediate thoughts on what are the tribal needs that would be priorities for you?
I can
Go
I can
ahead.
give Chaz a minute to think about it. As a planner, my thinking is always that there is a greater need for more detailed planning, for more detailed assessment and evaluation. And I think this, partly gets to Dr. Zaman's question to me earlier that, okay, we now know that drainage is our biggest issue related to climate, but we need those hydrologic studies to determine exactly which are the worst spots for that and where the culverts, for example, might need to be replaced right now. If there were, an infinite amount of funding, I would just recommend upsizing all the culverts, which is not necessarily the most prioritized and targeted and strategic solution. But I think that would be, a key area for the Pueblo of Laguna to be looking at with its transportation facilities as they relate to climate, and for other tribes in New Mexico and potentially within the entire region.
Do you feel like the tribes have the capacity to do those kinds of detailed studies?
I certainly feel like the tribes have the capacity to manage those detailed studies, but I feel like there's a need for more funding. Most tribes in New Mexico are not going to have engineers on staff that can do that work, but they absolutely are going to be able to partner with and manage projects with engineers to do that analysis.
Yeah, and I would say, unfortunately, not very many tribes have an engineer on staff and are willing to pay an engineer at full price. A lot of your native engineers either work for some of the firms, and occasionally you'll see a native firm or a capacity within a firm where they work with tribes specifically. But it's really rare that you have those in-house. Chaz, did you want to comment?
I mean, knowing that every tribe and every community has their own specific needs, and it's really going to be, ideally we'd have funding for these regional or even locally specific planning documents to be developed, just to identify what the threats are, what the immediate needs are, so that they can start to prioritize, so the tribes can start to prioritize for themselves what their needs are. And for some communities that may be wildfire, for other communities that may be tornadoes, for other or extreme events, and other tribes it may be flooding. But I really think it'd be great if we had funding available that would allow the tribes to have the information available to them so that they could actually develop priorities. And that may be regional studies that engineers and scientists could participate in, but it may involve planning assistance as well. But yeah, there's a lot of need there. But I think that my emphasis would be on allowing giving the information to the tribes so that they could actually make the prioritization determination.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Open up the floor.
Yeah, my name is Red Clark. I'm working with Oklahoma DOT with Larry's group and other producers in the state, working on trying to create more renewable materials and asphalt to produce more resilient pavements. But the questions that we have before us here, I think Larry covered the point that we've got better techniques for designing the road surface and producing a set of conditions where it's going to last. But the road doesn't last if you undermine it and you flood, take it out, flood the pavement and saturate it, or a host of other things. So as you already pointed out, the key is really understanding the hydrology of each individual basin and understanding where the problems are. And I think a second problem, which is being described here, is that there's just not enough money and there's not enough expertise to be able to do an in-depth flood mapping study, which is really what we're talking about here. Under a new set of assumptions for the magnitude and frequency of extreme flooding events and low flow events. So one workaround that you got a couple of options, and one is that FEMA is seeing more funding now, and they have more grants available to begin to support remapping floodplains. And I think, as you correctly point out, that's a huge priority. And the other is that you can take the existing flood insurance mapping that was done, and the government was required to retain records on model assumptions and output. And instead of redoing all of the hydrologic analysis associated with flood mapping, you've got the ability to go in and change some of the precipitation magnitude and frequency assumptions as inputs into these existing models and come up with a new map, if you will, that can then be translated into measurements of utility around culverts, bridges, low points in road surfaces, and things like avulsion, channel avulsions, when you're dealing with alluvial fan type flows in some of the drier areas of the country. So there are some short-term workarounds that you could get involved in. And as you said, you may not have a whole host of engineers, but if you put together sort of a consolidated effort along the lines of how flood insurance was originally mapped out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you wouldn't have to expend a massive amount of money to get reasonably close in terms of the needs that you're going to have for these individual locations. Look, you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good, and a full reevaluation of the basin would be great. There's no money for that. There isn't going to be money for that. So you've got to find a more efficient way to solve the problem. And I think the way to do it is to reopen the files and re-input new precipitation data, which ultimately is going to involve assumptions that other agencies have already put into place. So I think there's a workaround there if you want to put the time into it. And I don't think it would involve the kind of money that you're talking about in some of these planning studies to get the baseline data necessary to get that done.
I just would like to respond to that a little bit if I can, because I think it's important to note that wasn't actually done for everywhere, and there are many tribal lands that have never had that level of mapping done. There is no real flood insurance on most tribal lands. Most tribal homeowners do not get flood insurance. There are firm maps, but they're just the very basic information. I'm trying to remember if it's which zone it is, but unfortunately for many tribes, that was not really done. And so that information is not available. And so those studies really need to get off the ground. They also are generally riverine floodplains, as opposed to some of the drainage ways that we have in New Mexico, which are really the issues with the culverts. So unfortunately, it's a great solution in some areas, but it really isn't available to a lot of tribal communities.
I will say that since the 2012 Sandy Recovery Act, tribes have been able to create emergency management programs and start going after FEMA money. And this has had a huge area of growth in tribal in Indian country and across, and that's continuing to grow. So a lot of tribes don't even have emergency management plans in place. And the regions of FEMA are starting to get tribal liaisons and capacity in those regions. But at this time, there's only one tribal contact for the FEMA flood mapping for Indian country. And he keeps pretty busy, but it's a huge need and addition and area that I see as a continuing growth and development in that area. So.
If I could just make one more quick comment. I was involved in some of the work that was done with some of the nation's lands, particularly with respect to alluvial fan work and trying to model some of the extreme flows in those areas. So I know you're right that a lot of areas hadn't been fully covered. But with the influx of funding tied both to the infrastructure bill and to money that's already been flowing into FEMA, because all of the maps are becoming more and more out of date and need to be revised. There's a substantial body of money that is available now that wasn't before, that could be used, I think, to various landowners' advantage if they haven't had flood studies done before. The expertise is certainly out there, in terms of hiring it and managing it. It's something that could be done. And look, it's a basic planning tool. You can't design and repair a road if you don't have good hydrology in terms of what's passing around it or under it. Because no matter what you do on the road surface, if you undermine the base for any reason whatsoever, the bridge, the road, it's gone. So it's one of those key building blocks that if it's not in place, it can be put in place. The other good news is that although the surveys may not be all in place, the modeling tools that are available now compared to where they were 10, 20, 30 years ago are extraordinarily better, easier, and cheaper to run. And it's just a question of getting the right input data in order to get some good quality output. So I'm not suggesting that I've got the answer to all of your problems, but I think it's going to be easier to move forward in that direction. And I think you've been correct. The various speakers have been correct in identifying that this is a critical need that you've got to have before you focus on rebuilding or reconstituting the infrastructure.
So, Red Clark, I have a question, for you. I think these are excellent points that you mentioned. With that, and you talk about technology. So now you have, remote sensing and things that you do not have to actually, physically, and we all, look at the Google Earth map and so on. So what are your thoughts on some of these new technologies to enhance and assist in remapping?
Well, I think they're important tools. They're already being integrated into sort of the next generation of maps and map development. And one of the reasons that a number of the maps go out of date is that there are changes in land use over time, construction of flow impediments that didn't exist in the original study, and the ability to essentially use what we would characterize as remote sensing to gather and update data makes it much more useful. But if the basic problem is that the first fundamental study hasn't been done yet, there's limited utility to, vertical looks down because you don't have, for example, culvert openings. You don't have the dimensions on that. And therefore, or even if you've got an estimate of the flow that is going to be headed in that direction, you don't know if the culvert's going to be able to take it in. So it's a valuable add-on tool, but it is not the answer in itself.
Thank you.
I would just comment too that tribes, again, are going to contract out any hydrological modeling, most like that. Tribes do have water programs, but they're more focused on water quality and monitoring. And so they're going to work with a firm, a consultant, most likely to do any kind of advanced hydrological modeling like that.
April, one suggestion, and that would be that there appears to be a fairly broad need here to have the work done. And oftentimes what happens with government procurement is that they'll hire 15, 20, 30, 40 firms to do essentially repeat work on related areas, one next to another. In the history of the flood insurance program, they bid these jobs out on a municipality basis almost, or at best on a small basin basis. If you had one group that was working hand in hand with the nations. For example, you'd be able to eliminate an awful lot of data searching and overlap and be able to reduce the costs of putting something like this together in relatively short order. I would imagine the government would be willing to listen to something like that now. It was politically a lot more difficult in the past. I don't think that's the case now.
And then, of course, jurisdictional issues. And so a lot of these communities have not worked with the tribes or multiple tribes in their communities. And so there's just those hurdles as well and sovereignty.
Any other questions?
Questions? Before we wrap this up, we've got a few more minutes.
I just noted in the chat also regarding the FEMA funding that I think that is a terrific opportunity. One of the challenges for some tribes is the matching funds, but that can be in kind. And I think some of the conversations that we're having and some of the opportunities with different partnerships could really be valuable to tribes in terms of that in-kind support and being able to put dollar figures associated with those partnerships with other engineers and institutions might be able to make the difference in terms of coming up with that in-kind.
There's another element that if Larry Patrick is still with us, he may want to comment on this, but we've been working with Oklahoma DOT and other state DOTs and Federal Highway Administration to find ways to make roads last a lot longer. As Larry pointed out, there are a lot of different additives out there. We're working with chemically engineered chrome rubber as one part of that solution. And one of the nice things about what's happening with these advances in paving is that thinner pavements are lasting longer than thicker traditional pavements, meaning that overlays and reconstruction or revitalization of road assets have the ability for lasting quite a bit longer than they did before. And so one of the things that is constantly stealing money away from other programs is the fact that whatever infrastructure you built doesn't last very long and it has to be refunded over and over again. And this is especially difficult when you're talking about light and medium duty roads as opposed to heavy duty roads where you don't have a lot of traffic, but you're trying to keep a diffuse population linked together commercially and economically with a good road system. So the Oklahoma DOT and the Department of Environmental Quality in Oklahoma both have got some really interesting programs that are moving forward that I think are going to help the nations deal with some of these other infrastructure challenges that happen beyond the hydrologic evaluation and proper sizing of your culverts.
That's what I was trying to say earlier. There is technology now that we didn't have 5-10 years ago. And it's now there. And there's technology that we had previously 20 years ago that has really updated itself to the point that we can make a durable road out there now for whether it's medium use, heavy use, truck traffic, whatever. The technology's there that we can do this now.
Well, I think we've had a great discussion today, and I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists, Sharon Hosman and Chaz Jones, for their time today and sharing their expertise and knowledge with us. So if you want to use your app and thank them or applaud them or in the chat box, take a moment and say thank you. I think it's been a really interesting roundtable and discussion today. Thank you so much.
So I just want to add, my 2 cents. I'm really greatly thankful on behalf of SPTC and Oklahoma DOT, for this roundtable. We normally have more like seminars and so on, and a special, thanks to April for facilitating this, and also to our panel members, Sharon and Chaz. And I think we really ask the audience, thanks to all of you for asking questions. It has been very informative And I think if you are interested in actually doing more of this type of roundtable, SPTC will be more than happy to facilitate that. So please suggest, and the slides will be available on the SPTC website. And Sharon and Chaz and April, if it's okay with you, then I think maybe there might be some follow-up questions, to you all as well. It has been an absolute pleasure, and want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule in the beginning of the week. It has been a great opportunity, to listen to you all. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for having
Thank you
us.
so much for having us.
Thank you.
Be well.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.